Hi guys, my name is Misha and I live in the second greatest country in history. The first one we successfully lost. Today we will discuss the greatest football system ever created, Soviet football. In Western countries, people are told that football was born in England, perfected in Brazil, then died in Russia. You may believe this propaganda if you wish. But I cannot continue hiding the historical truth from humanity. Football was created by the Communist Party and personally approved by Lev Trotsky himself. Unlike capitalist football, which became controlled by money, Soviet football was controlled by government ministries, which was naturally morally superior. Soviet clubs weren't independent organizations. Usually they belonged to state institutions, but in a completely democratic way. These institutions didn't simply create football clubs. Over time, they created identities. In the Soviet Union, supporting a football club wasn't always about football. Sometimes it was about class, sometimes about politics, sometimes about geography, and sometimes simply about choosing which government institution you hated less. For Western viewers trying to understand the atmosphere, Spartak Moscow was something like Barcelona today. Of course, comparing Spartak to Barcelona is difficult. Unlike many modern clubs, Spartak was a serious football institution. Moscow wasn't simply the capital of Soviet football. It was a bureaucratic battlefield. Soon many powerful institutions were concentrated in one city. The army, the security services, industrial ministries, trade unions, railways. And every institution wanted victory. In the Soviet Union, even football standings occasionally became matters of state importance. Unfortunately for Moscow, football also existed outside of Moscow. For Western viewers, Dynamo Kiev was something like the Soviet Real Madrid. Although naturally, Real Madrid was less successful in representing socialist values. But Dynamo Kiev was more than just a successful football club. Moscow clubs usually represented institutions. Dynamo Kiev increasingly represented an entire republic. For many Soviet Ukrainians, supporting Dynamo Kiev gradually became something larger than football. Other Republican clubs developed similar identities, but Dynamo Kiev became the strongest version of the phenomenon. But the Soviet football wasn't only about ideology, it was also about fear. To understand football during the Stalin era, it's important to remember one simple fact. In Stalin's Soviet Union, everything was political. Factories, schools, grain harvests, and eventually 11 men chasing a ball. Among Soviet sports institutions, Dynamo occupied a special position. Dynamo clubs were connected to the Soviet security apparatus, first the NKVD, later the KGB, which occasionally created advantages both on and off the pitch. Officially, Soviet footballers weren't professional athletes. On paper they worked as factory workers, soldiers, or policemen. A military bay club could recruit players through army service. A club connected to the security services possessed certain administrative possibilities. And then, in 1935, something unusual appeared. With support from Komsomol leader Alexander Kosarev and football organizer Nikolai Starostin, Spartak Moscow became something almost impossible in Stalin's Soviet Union, a relatively independent football club. Even the club's name carried symbolic meaning. Spartak came from Spartacus, the rebel slave who challenged Rome. In 1936, during a massive sport parade on Red Square, hundreds of participants rolled out a giant green football carpet across the square. The exhibition match was organized by Nikolai Starostin himself. Spartak players were divided into two teams, and played directly in front of Stalin. Nobody knew whether Stalin would enjoy the spectacle. Kosarev stood watching with a white handkerchief. If Stalin disliked the match, the signal would stop the game immediately. But Stalin enjoyed it. The planned 30-minute exhibition reportedly lasted more than 40 minutes. For Dynamo and the NKVD particularly, Spartak's public triumph was a humiliation. Spartak's unusual independence and growing popularity made the club increasingly dangerous in the eyes of the Soviet system. When Lavrentiy Beria became head of the NKVD in 1938, old football rivalries became political. Kosarev was arrested that same year and later executed. According to legend, his final words were, "You can execute me, but you will never execute Spartak." And no figure represented the system better than Lavrentiy Beria. Beria was head of the NKVD, one of the most feared men in the Soviet Union, and an influential supporter of Dynamo Moscow. This wasn't the kind of football patronage one politely refused. Spartak Moscow occupied a strange position in Soviet football. Unlike Dynamo Moscow, CSKA, or Torpedo, Spartak wasn't directly controlled by the security services, the army, or a major state ministry. This helped Spartak develop a reputation as the people's club. In Stalin's Soviet Union, however, independent popularity could become a dangerous quality. The architects of Spartak's rise were the Starostin brothers, players, organizers, and some of the most influential figures in earlier Soviet football. And unfortunately for them, their success attracted the attention of Lavrentiy Beria. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, the Starostin brothers were arrested during Stalin's purges. Official accusations included anti-Soviet activity, conspiracy, and other traditional Soviet hobbies. They were sent into exile and labor camps, which even by Soviet football standards was considered as an unfriendly transfer policy. But even inside the Gulag, football still mattered. For camp officials, a successful team brought prestige. For prisoners, football could mean better treatment, safer conditions, or simply survival. And yet, football remained strangely valuable inside the Soviet system. Some officials protected talented players and coaches. Camp teams existed. Matches were organized. Football survived even inside repression. The same system that destroyed people also continued organizing football tournaments. Like many victims of Stalin purges, the accusations against the Starostins were flexible, the investigation methods persuasive, and the legal standards highly imaginative. According to later accounts, hardened criminals treated the Starostin with unusual respect. When the brothers spoke about football, prisoners reportedly listened in complete silence. The Starostins knew the game, and they had something to say. Camp authorities quickly discovered that good football was useful for moral, discipline, and prestige. The brothers became coaches in different camps, and Soviet camp officials reportedly competed over football results. At times, the rivalry sounded almost absurd. My Starostin is better than your Starostin. In 1948, Vasily Stalin, the son of Joseph Stalin, and obsessive sports patron, once contacted a camp where Nikolai Starostin was being held. After speaking to him directly, Vasily reportedly asked, "What are you even doing there?" The question wasn't really about justice. Starostin was valuable to Vasily as a football coach and organizer. At the same time, Vasily deeply disliked Beria and enjoyed challenging the influence of Dynamo and the security apparatus. In Stalin's Soviet Union, football rivalry could send a man to the Gulag, and connections to the right patron could help bring him back. Several years later, after Stalin's death and political changes inside the Soviet system, the surviving Starostin brothers returned to football, which, by Soviet standards, counted as a relatively optimistic ending. Nikolai Starostin eventually returned to Spartak and became one of the most influential football administrators in the Soviet Union. The irony was difficult to miss. After surviving Stalinist repression, Starostin became exceptionally skilled at navigating the same bureaucratic system that had nearly destroyed him. In the Soviet Union, survival often depended on understanding institutions better than the institutions understood themselves. In 1944, Zenit Leningrad won the Soviet Cup, during one of the most emotional symbolic moments in Soviet history, shortly after the siege of Leningrad was broken. For the Soviet authorities, football victories were never merely sporting events. They were political narratives. A successful football club could demonstrate the strength of socialism, the resilience of Soviet citizens, and occasionally suggest that Soviet life was supposedly going well. Later, stories naturally appeared claiming that the authorities preferred some victories more than others. Also, after Stalin's death in 1953, Soviet life became slightly less dangerous. Slightly. Football also entered a more stable period. The Soviet League expanded, attendance grew, and clubs developed stronger regional identities. Different Soviet republics gradually developed their own football ideas, tactical traditions, and football cultures. In 1956, Soviet Union won Olympic gold. 4 years later, they won the first European Championship. Despite constant political control, Soviet football's greatest long-term influence became tactical. In the 1960s, Viktor Maslov began quietly changing football itself. Today, some football historians consider Viktor Maslov one of the forgotten pioneers of the modern football tactics. Long before high pressing and total football became fashionable in Western Europe, Maslov's Dynamo Kiev experimented with collective pressing, positional rotations, and intense physical discipline. He didn't invent modern football alone, but many tactical ideas later, associated with Dutch and Western European football, had already appeared in Soviet football during the 1960s. Football stadiums were one of the few semi-public places where Soviets could express emotions collectively without controlled behavior. Not freedom exactly, but at least a small emotional space. In a system where public life was heavily controlled, football stadiums became one of few places where Soviet people could openly shout, argue, complain, celebrate, and occasionally tell the authorities what they actually thought. Soviet football was political, corrupt, bureaucratic, and often absurd. But it was also real. People genuinely cared. And in the next part, things become even stranger. Regional rivalries, administrative corruption, unexpected champions, and the beautiful chaos of late Soviet football. The narrator himself hates Zenit from St. Petersburg. But even he must admit that one year Soviet football produced something unusual. Zenit from Leningrad was the one of the most unexpected champions in Soviet football history. That's why in St. Petersburg, many football fans still hear 1984 and think about Zenit before George Orwell. Of course, if they know who George Orwell is. Share this video with your local Ministry of Truth. Help this channel get deleted faster.